But then, of course, the more I delved into his figure, I realized that Ne Zha is in fact an Indian figure. Ne Zha, you see, the name Ne Zha is not Chinese. Ne Zha is the shortened form of a transcribed Sanskrit name. Nalakubara figured in Buddhist literature that was translated into Chinese during the first millennium, and his name Nalakubara became in Chinese Naja Lo. And Naja Lo, when it was shortened, it was too long, so it was transformed into Naja. So in fact, Naja is not a Chinese name. It's very clearly a Sanskrit name.
नेजा, कई सदियां बीत गई, क्या तुम मेरे साथ इस लड़ाई में शामिल होगे?
लड़ना है ना, इसमें तो मैं माहिर हूँ। मैं हूँ नेजा, तीसरा और इकलौता राजकुमार।
So nowadays China is a global power. Everyone looks to China. Many countries in Asia emulate China. Perhaps today, some people in India want India to be as powerful as China, yes. But historically, China didn't influence India. It was India that influenced China.
नेजा, अपनी ताकत पर भरोसा रखो। तुम लूम महल को घुटनों पे ला दोगे। बच के रहना क्योंकि मैं आ गया हूँ। Neza 2. Purchase April.
Today, we are diving into a fascinating tale of mythology and cinema as the Chinese animated blockbuster Ne Zha 2 prepares to hit Indian screens. This release, coinciding with 75 years of India-China diplomatic ties and a thawing relations, feels like a cultural homecoming. Why? Because Ne Zha, the film's fiery hero, has roots in Indian mythology. To unpack this Indo-Chinese connection, I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Meir Shahar, a leading scholar of Chinese religion and mythology from Israel. Based at the Tel Aviv University, where he holds the Shaul N. Eisenberg Chair for East Asian Affairs, Professor Shahar is the author of Oedipal God, the Chinese Ne Zha, and his Indian origins, and numerous other studies on cross-cultural myths. His work has revealed how Ne Zha's story traveled from India to China. And today, he will share those insights with us. Professor Shahar, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, my pleasure.
So before we dive into Ne Zha, Professor Shahar, could you tell us, coming from Israel, how you first became interested in Chinese and Indian mythologies? What drew you to these rich, interesting traditions in the first place?
So, as you said, I grew up in Israel, and many years ago, since my childhood, I've been interested in literature, in religion, but I didn't want to study something with which I was already familiar. I might mention that my late father, David Shahar, was a Hebrew writer. He wrote novels in Hebrew. And my late mother, Shulamit Shahar, was a historian of medieval Europe. So somehow Europe, Christianity, Judaism, they all seemed very familiar to me. I wanted an adventure. I wanted to travel to continents, to cultures that I wasn't familiar with. And therefore, I chose China. At that time, I'm talking 40 years ago, there were no diplomatic relations between China and Israel. And there were really hardly any Chinese people in Israel, hardly at all. Nowadays, by the way, my wife is Chinese. But at that time, I haven't seen a Chinese person, I think, in my life, and I didn't know anything about China. And precisely because I knew nothing, I decided to study Chinese and immerse myself in Chinese culture. And I started studying at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I took courses on Confucianism, on Chinese philosophy. And at the same time, at the Hebrew University, there was and still is an eminent scholar of India, of Indian literature. You probably know his name, Professor David Schulman. You know the name. He's a great scholar of especially South Indian languages and literatures, Tamil, Telugu, and other languages of South India. And I took courses on Indian mythology with him, and I studied Sanskrit with him. And Indian mythology just blew me away. It was just so fascinating. I used to say that, in Freudian psychology, They say that there is such a thing as a sensor of your dreams, that when you dream, what you are actually dreaming is not what you want to dream, but there is a sensor that change your dreams so that they would somehow echo with moral principles, so that your dreams won't be too outrageous. But when I read Indian mythology, it seems to me like there is no censor there. It was all so fascinating and so amazing. For example, the legends about Krishna, how he stole butter and how his mother asked him to open his mouth. And inside his mouth, she saw the entire universe and all the galaxies. And when she looked more closely, she noticed the Indian subcontinent. And when she looked even more closely, she saw her native village. And when she looked even more closely, she saw herself looking into her son's mouth. So
Right.
these legends really amazed me.
Right.
And but I then went and did a PhD at Harvard in America on Chinese literature and religion, and I somehow put Indian culture on the side. I left it. But then, to my great delight, the more I delved into Chinese mythology of the late imperial period or Chinese mythology of the second millennium CE, the more I noticed the influence of Indian culture, which I studied many years earlier as an undergraduate in Jerusalem. And that's how my research turned into the connection between India and China, between Indian mythology and Chinese literature and religion.
How fascinating. So, when did you first encounter the character of Nezha, and what was it about this character that captivated, your imagination enough to make him the focus of your research? I believe you first explored Nezha in a chapter that you contributed to the 2014 volume India in the Chinese Imagination, published by the
Yes,
University of Pennsylvania Press.
yes. Eh, in fact, at the very beginning, I was always interested in rebellious figures, in figures that do not conform to social norms or figures that rebel against authority. Uh, when you start studying Chinese culture, they always tell you, for example, that filial piety is the most important Chinese virtue, which is true. And in China, filial piety is the cornerstone, not only of familial values, but also of political theory. Because he who knows how to serve his parents will know how to serve the emperor, will know how to be a good citizen. So filial piety is the foundation. But I was interested in figures that rebel against authority, in gods such as Monkey from the Journey to the West, or such as there is a god, a clown god called Jigong or Crazy G that I wrote a book about. So at first I became interested in Ne Zha because he is a rebellious figure. And I wasn't thinking about India at first. I was also very much interested in Freudian theory and the Oedipus complex.
Right.
As you know, Freud claimed that the Oedipus complex is universal, that every child, his first sexual attraction is to his mother, and his first enemy is his father. And
Right.
there were scholars, anthropologists, who said that he is wrong, that this is not universal, that
Mhm.
this might be true of Europe, might be true of Jewish or Christian culture, but it's not universally true. But I felt that he is right, that there is something there that is true of all human societies. And the story of Ne Zha is clearly an Oedipal story because Ne Zha tries to kill his father and he tries to do it consciously. It's a remarkable story. It's also very interesting how the story is told in China in a manner that makes it acceptable to Confucian culture.
You expanded your research into a full-length book, Oedipal God, the Chinese
Yes,
legend and his Indian origins. I believe it was
yes,
published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2015. And this was
yes,
around 4 years before the first Chinese animated film on the topic, Ne Zha, was released, and almost, or say nearly a decade before Ne Zha 2, which has released this year and has become such a phenomenal sensation. It has become the highest grossing animated film globally, earning over $2.1 billion. So, how do you feel about the global success of this film also? centered on a character that has played such a central role in your scholarly work?
Yeah, it's strange. I guess I should feel lucky and and privileged that I was interested in him before that. The truth of the matter is that there is a magnificent animated movie on Ne Zha that was created as early as the 70s, I think, in China, much earlier than that. A very beautiful movie that I saw and that I wrote about. So the recent craze, Ne Zha craze, I don't know how to explain it. Um, yeah, in Taiwan, by the way, in Taiwan, Ne Zha is very, very popular and has always been. And if you go to Taiwan, there are many temples where he's worshipped and many spirit mediums that are possessed by him. I saw the new movie in Shanghai last month. Last
Wonderful.
month I was in Shanghai and I saw the new movie. Yeah, yeah,
So,
but what can I say?
but coming back to the topic and how you find this connection with the Indian origin. So,
Yeah,
I believe your research identifies Najha's origins to an Indian character, Nalakubara, the son of Kubera, who's basically the god of wealth and king of the yakshas or nature spirits in the Indian mythology. And
yes,
Nalakubara is also the nephew of Ravana, which is who's a very famous demon king of Lanka from the famous Indian epic, the Ramayana. So, can you
yes.
briefly explain how you trace this connection and why it is significant for understanding Najha's character?
So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Ne Zha, you see, the name Ne Zha is not Chinese. If you learn Chinese language, you immediately notice that Ne Zha is not a Chinese word. Ne Zha is the shortened form of a transcribed Sanskrit name. Nalakubara figured in Buddhist literature that was translated into Chinese during the first millennium as and his name Nalakubara became in Chinese Naja Juvalo. And Naja Juvalo, when it was shortened, it was too long, so it was transformed into Naja. And then by another phonetic small change, Naja became Nerja. So in fact, Nerja is not a Chinese name. It's very clearly a Sanskrit name spoken or transcribed into Chinese characters. Now, here, if you will permit me, I will broaden the discussion before I go back to Ne Zha. During the, as you all know, as you know very, very well, Buddhism came to China during the first centuries of the Common Era. Buddhism arrived from India to China. And Buddhism has had a tremendous impact on China. And the impact was not only religious, rather, Buddhism, as a product of Indian culture, served as a vehicle for the impact of Chinese civilization on China at large. It's very interesting. Nowadays, China is a superpower. India is also a coming superpower, but China is perhaps a little earlier. So nowadays, China is a global power. Everyone looks to China. Many countries in Asia emulate China. Perhaps today, some people in India want India to be as powerful as China. Yes, perhaps. You will correct me. But historically, China didn't influence India. It was India that influenced China. It was India that influenced China. And the influence of India on China was enormous. As you know, thousands of Sanskrit scriptures were translated from Sanskrit to Chinese. And these scriptures introduced China to Indian mathematics and Indian grammar and Indian philosophy and Indian literature. Buddhism came to China with Buddhist art, and Buddhist art has had a tremendous influence on China. By way of comparison, whereas thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of books were translated from Sanskrit to Chinese, historically, we don't know even of one book translated from Chinese to Sanskrit, historically. Perhaps there are stories that the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, the Chinese emperor ordered Xuanzang to translate it into Sanskrit, but we don't know if it ever happened or if it ever had an impact on India. If you'll permit me, I'll give a few small
Sure,
examples
please
of
go
this
ahead.
Indian influence before we return to Ne Zha.
Sure, sure.
For example, right now I'm sitting on a chair. Yes, I imagine that you two are sitting, as you interview me, are sitting on a chair. But this thing, this object, chair, was brought to China from India.
Mhm.
Prior to Buddhism, the Chinese crouched on mats. They had no chairs. Yes, to this day, in Chinese they don't say chairman Mao. They
Mhm.
actually say chairmat. That's the word in Chinese. The person who sits on the mat, on the principal mat. Yes.
Right.
So this object, the chair, was brought to China from India by Indian Buddhist monks. To give another example, the Chinese drink tea. Yes. In fact, the practice of drinking tea was introduced to China by Indian Buddhist monks. The word tea, of course, the plant tree exists in China,
Right.
but the culture of drinking tea is the product of Buddhist influence from India. And one last example before I go back to Ne Zha, if you permit me. The very idea of a statue of a god, the very idea of a statue, of an icon of a god that is an object of worship, apparently, probably arrived to China from India. When we look at Chinese art prior to the arrival of Buddhism, we don't find statues of gods. We don't find a statue that looks that the worshiper faces and worship. There are
Mhm.
images of gods in profile, but there is no such thing of a statue of a god that is being worshipped.
Right.
The first statues of gods came to China from India. These were statues of the Buddha. And they had a tremendous, the Chinese were really captivated by them. So, in short, India has had a tremendous impact, long term impact on China, and in particular, Indian gods, the products of the wonderful and magnificent Indian imagination. So you mentioned, for example, Vaishravana, Kubera. Kubera, his
Mhm.
other name is Vaishravana. He's the father of Nalakubara, the father of Ne Zha. Vaishravana was introduced to China by by esoteric Buddhist scriptures. He was introduced to China as a warrior god. He captivated the Chinese imagination as a warrior god, less as a god of riches than as a god of war. And he became very, very important in Chinese culture. Uh, it's very surprising, that because he's very strong, Vaishravana, he was worshipped by martial artists. During the Tang Dynasty, that is the 7th century, the 8th century, Chinese wrestlers, Chinese wrestlers would tattoo their bodies with the image of Vaishravana, with the image of Kubera,
I
the
see.
Indian god,
Mhm.
because they wanted to be as strong as Vaishravana. So they had his tattoo inscribed on their bodies. So in fact, it was the father of Nalakubara, that became a very important warrior god in China. But he arrived to China with his offspring, that is to say, with Nalakubara and Nalakubara's brother Manigriva, both of them, or Manibhadra, both of them. And they became like messengers of their father. So when the Tang emperor sent an army to battle, these sons of Vaishravana were called upon to help the Chinese army. They conducted rituals, like Buddhist rituals, and they called upon these Indian gods to help the Chinese emperor. So this is how Nalakubara arrived to China. However, as you mentioned in our previous in our preliminary conversations, Nalakubara is not an important figure in Indian mythology.
Yes, that's what I wanted to know. So Nalakubara, who was a relatively minor figure in Indian epics,
Yes,
became this rebellious lotus-born Nezha in the investiture of gods.
yes.
How did it happen? How did this transformation happen? If you can,
I
and yes, throw some light on this.
Yeah, I think that's what I argue in my book, that Nalakubara, as it arrived, as he was introduced to China, he came colored in the hues of Krishna. In fact, it was not only Nalakubara that arrived to China, it was Krishna. By the way, we know that in Quanzhou, a port city in South China,
I have
there
visited
was
those
a temple. Yeah, there
the,
was a
the
temple for
temple.
Krishna. Yeah.
Yes,
So, Indian merchants, they established a temple for him in China. And by the way, many, many other Indian gods, Shiva and Vishnu and who not, everyone, Ganesha, they all arrived to China.
right,
Brahma, they all came to China with Buddhist literature. Buddhism adopted Indian gods, Hindu gods, non-Buddhist gods, and brought them to China. Now, when you look at Krishna and Ne Zha, you see great resemblance. Great resemblance. First of all, Krishna, as you know, his principal feat was killing the dragon Kaliya, the
Kali.
dragon.
Yes,
Yeah, and dragon, the word in Sanskrit, naga,
Naga.
yes,
It's a multi-headed snake.
yes, or
Yes,
cobra or multi-headed snake. This creature, naga, was translated into Chinese as long,
right,
which we translate into English as dragon.
right,
But it's the same animal.
right,
The animal that Ne Zha subdues as an infant, as a small child, is exactly the animal that Krishna subdues as a small infant. I mean, that's so wonderful about these two gods. They are both little children. Yes, I started the interview mentioning the story of Krishna, the boy, stealing the butter
right.
and his mother looking into his mouth. So Ne Zha and Krishna, they are child gods, and that's what makes them lovable. But even though they are children, they are immensely powerful. So Krishna kills the dragon, the cobra or the snake, Kaliya, and Ne Zha kills the same animal at the same age. That's one feat. The other feat is drawing a bow that no one can draw, that is incredibly heavy, that was left by some primordial god. Yes. So Krishna draws a bow that no one was able to lift. And later, that's Krishna. By the way, Krishna is, of course, an avatar, or is considered an avatar of Vishnu.
Vishnu and Rama.
And Rama, who is another avatar of Vishnu, does exactly the same thing.
Exactly the same. Yes.
Exactly the same
I
thing.
could relate it. Yes.
Yeah,
Mm.
and Ne Zha also does the same thing. One of his childhood feats is Ne Zha finds a bow that no one is able to draw, and he draws it. So they perform the same physical feats, the same feats
Right.
of power, and scholars say they share the same Oedipal tendencies
Mhm.
because Krishna doesn't have a father really, but he is in conflict with a surrogate father figure. This is his uncle. The
Kansa.
uncle, yes, it's his uncle, and that he eventually kills and inherit his throne.
Right.
So we have here in both cases a child that is supernaturally powerful, and a child that rebels against paternal, or if you want, against paternal authority, either his biological father or an uncle figure. Now,
Right.
in my book, I try to show Nalakubara is, of course, related to Krishna because there is a story how Krishna uprooted a tree that was, in fact, Nalakubara.
Yes. There are these stories within stories, layers
Yes.
within layers in the Indian mythology. So I
So,
read it up, of course. Yes. Hmm.
yeah, so in fact, it is not improbable that when Nalakubara came to China, he came with the entire story cycle of Krishna as well. And somehow the two figures merged, giving birth to what is now a global success,
Right.
the Ne Zha movie.
So to get a bit more clarity, the incident one, of course, Nalakubara's two major incidents which are highlighted in the Indian mythology. One is in Ramayana, where his wife Rambha was actually believed to have been sexually assaulted or raped by Ravana, and after which Nalakubara cursed Ravana that if he touches any woman without the woman's permission, that the Ravana's head will blast into multiple pieces. As
Yes.
a result, he was never able to, or he never touched the heroine of Ramayana, Sita. So that's one incident. And the second incident that you were just mentioning about Krishna, these two are minor incidents. How then in China, Nezha, his story or his character became such a fascinating, multifaceted, such a grandeur, and has been
Yeah,
into this hero now.
yeah, you mentioned correctly the two episodes about Nalakubara. What is interesting about them is that, especially the episode with his uncle Ravana, is that in these stories as well about Nalakubara, there is an element of a generational conflict, of a conflict between a young man or a young boy and an elder figure of authority, and there is some kind of sexual competition between them, which we later find in the Ne Zha story in China. But beyond these elements, and even if this we must say, there's no question that Ne Zha came to China from India. I believe that there is a strong influence of the Krishna legend, but this doesn't preclude the independent evolution that occurred in China. That is to say, the figure of Ne Zha as we know him today is a product of the Chinese imagination. Yeah. I mean, the Indian figure was transformed in China. It didn't remain the same.
From a cultural perspective, what do you think drives the character's universal appeal, and especially its resonance with modern audience?
I would imagine that perhaps this figure of a handsome, young, courageous, rebellious, fearless young man is always appealing, I guess. All I can say is that, and I imagine that it's also simply because the movie is good, is artistically appealing.
Right.
Because it's a success, it's a technological success.
And considering, of course, because you have your research which have connected Ne Zha with the Indian mythology, and I personally was very fascinated being an Indian and being interested in China as well. So do you think that the Indian audience will somehow look at this movie's release in India as some sort of a homecoming, in a new, an Indian mythological character who was not known much, but who kind of went to China, made his name, and now coming back to India in this new Chinese avatar?
That's a wonderful way of putting it. Mm-hmm. In any event, what I'm sure that you phrase it wonderfully, you much better than I could. But what I can say is that the Indians really should be proud, or might be proud, that they've had a tremendous impact upon the imagination of not only China, but East Asia at large. If you go to any Japanese temple, Korean temple, I mean, India gave Asia the Buddhist faith, and with Buddhism came Indian culture at large. So, there is a lot to be happy and proud about.
Right. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your sharing these interesting insights about both the cultures and the mythology. As Ne Zha 2 prepares to captivate Indian audience on April 25th, your work reminds us how stories can bridge cultures, especially at a time when India and China are forging stronger ties.
Thank you very much. It was an honor and a pleasure.
अपनी ताकत पर भरोसा रखो। तुम लूम महल को घुटनों पे ला दोगे। बच के रहना क्योंकि मैं आ गया हूँ। Ne Zha 2 25 अप्रैल से